Do we pass it around? Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I was almost late today due to a series of unfortunate events involving Docker and the temporary file system of a Linux container. So yeah, this is going to be very near and dear to my heart today. The first thing that we should talk about, why is it not updating? Thoughts, suggestions? Oh yes, yes. Maybe I should unplug it and replug it in. Well, spoiler alert, the first slide is basically how do we want to define, like what do we mean? What do you think of when I say DevOps? Just deployment? What about, is automation a part of that? Do I? Yes? Automation? I think, I always, working together.
Working together. For me, I tweeted this a while ago, but I see DevOps as, in the silo part, I see separate teams working with their own individual end goals, and I see DevOps as being what it's supposed to be, is where everyone works together to achieve the same goal. So it's everyone's working in common instead of simply just working together. I know that's like, let's whatever.
I got a comment.
Okay, so David just pointed out the positiveness of DevOps. The opposite side of it, and it's not necessarily my view, but I've seen this many times, is sometimes I think DevOps is developers trying to justify rolling their own code into production and managing it, and which is fine for smaller projects, but when you get into larger corporations and they have a DevOps team, I get a little iffy sometimes thinking, what does that mean? Because at some degree, I feel like you might need both a development and an operations team. Anyway, not necessarily my point of view, but I've seen it happen in negative ways like that. So, the other side of DevOps.
Yeah, like I kind of wonder if it's not a term that large companies have taken to kind of give the impression that they work more like smaller companies. Because almost every company that I've ever worked with, there's never been a dedicated ops team, and so the developers have always been responsible for getting code into production, making sure it operates, being aware of errors, monitoring, all of that kind of stuff. And so it's kind of, to me, seems like a way that larger organizations signal that they want to operate more like a smaller organization.
This is going to be interesting. Yes, we need to automate the movement of the microphone. Yeah, so that's really interesting. I work in a larger company now that definitely has dedicated ops people. But I don't know, for me, DevOps is definitely more like a familiarity with like what is it's like going on as far as operations. Like I feel like developers should have, and I have a slide later that apparently this is currently frozen and not moving, but we can just sort of freeform it. It'll be more fun that way, I guess. But yeah, so we sort of already touched on this. The second slide was what is the difference between like, or how does automation fit into your concept of DevOps? For me, I feel like the like automation is what separates like DevOps from just like ops. At least in our larger company, we have like ops engineers that basically handle like infrastructure and stuff like that. Whereas like DevOps is more how we are using that infrastructure to streamline things like deployment processes. We work on like many simultaneous projects that all need to sort of get deployed and have good pipelines and whatever. So yeah, that's kind of where I fall in the whole DevOps ops discussion. You probably have lots of good things to say.
I was late, so I have to I have to figure out what we're talking about, I guess. I see a lot of enterprises, big enterprises, who most definitely have ops teams separate from dev teams, separate from QA teams, separate from sometimes like a lot more teams. Every time you see somebody hand code off to somebody else, that's where I think we're not DevOps. I think the idea of DevOps is sort of, to me, a word we keep using to talk about anything that like helps us either hand off faster or stop having to hand off at all. A lot of the human side of DevOps, I haven't heard in the last 5 seconds since I came in, as the fact that it's not just how do I get my code running in prod, and how do I get my developers and ops to do the same kind of technical stuff, but then how do I like get the things they're doing in the heads of each other, right? So that like I think this week I've been working with one of my clients on is the idea that like if the devs are thinking about your code running in prod, then they're going to include stuff the code does, like health checks or logging consistently, or having debug versus info versus warrant versus error, and then something that's watching those logs and bringing what matters to humans so they can act based on what the applications are outputting in an environment, right? I think DevOps is about what happens when all of these concerns are in the same heads at the same time, maybe.
So actually touches something that I did want to bring up, as far as like most of us here, I think, are developers mostly. And how much ops like should we be, like you're sort of saying like DevOps is like where we're sort of marrying that, where the dev team knows what's going on the ops side and is like planning for that. The particular issue that I had earlier today had to do with a misunderstanding of how the temporary file system works in Linux and how it clears out on reboot, and if you're running a Docker container that that whenever it handles an immutable deploy, it's never actually clearing that. So as the application runs, the temporary directory can fill up, and then the Docker container doesn't reboot. So like how much as developers do we think we should be like paying attention to these particular issues?
So yeah, I am definitely primarily a developer, but I've found myself getting my foot stuck in some stinky ops stuff on occasion. Where I'm at, I kind of put us on that. I'm going to say this, and I don't like it, but I'm going to say it. The DevOps team, I don't think DevOps is a team. It's more of a culture of the way you work. But we're the ones that kind of stand in between the applications and the infrastructure. So we happen to deal with a lot of both sides of things, trying to automate the infrastructure and the servers and the network, and trying to get the application developers. I don't think that the developers really need to get into the nitty-gritty of like networking and the server and everything, but it's important that we all have to keep cognizant and thoughtful of what's on the server. What am I using? How is it going to affect what I need on the server? How is it going to affect what I need on the network? How does the network traffic flow? How is the network set up? You don't need to have a deep thought capability of network segmentation and VLANs and all that stuff, but it kind of helps to understand that, okay, I need to know the environment that my application is going to run in, so that when there's a problem, I have an idea of, oh, I did this wrong. I told it to go to this particular IP or this address, and that's on a different VLAN, that's on a different network segment, so it's not going to hit that, or this new tool I'm going to use is going to require a new version of this other tool or framework that's on the server. And well, since we're not on Docker yet, because we're not, that's going to require that server have the updated set of frameworks. And so, okay, how is that going to affect anything? So it starts to bring that whole idea of having a common mindset instead of just, stop thinking about your own individual queue of things that you have to get done, but try to see how what your workload is going to affect the next person down the line.
Well, and I think you're both kind of hitting on this, is that we as developers actually know what our application needs more than the ops team. So if you have disk resources that you need, you know that intimately what your own resources are, as opposed to kind of external. And I think what we're heading into, and I think you kind of started to hit on that, is that we're heading into that day and age where those health checks are more of a dependency of the application itself as opposed to all these things that happen externally saying, oh, I'm monitoring disk space. Well, the server may have plenty of disk space, but temp might not. You know, and your application knows those things as opposed to, so I think as developers, it's becoming, it kind of moves some of this downstream to us that we might not have thought it had to think about before. Because suddenly there's all these things like I'm running in a container with limited resources, as opposed to, oh, I'm handing this off to some giant server and it'll be fine. Don't leave me with a microphone.
I'd want to re-ask the question, I think. I'm really interested in what, I've been in development more years than I guess you would guess. And I didn't start in development, I started in ops. I did servers way before I got paid to do code anyway. And I've seen a surprisingly number of different attitudes about what is your job to understand or learn as a developer. And I'm curious to hear, you know, where a lot of you stand nowadays. Over the years, I've heard people stop at, my Eclipse isn't installed properly. Here's my computer, fix it. Or other people who they're fine doing that, but they don't want. I'm from the Java side. Let me try to translate to Ruby. my sorry, my Sublime Text isn't working, or I can't get to the internet, but I can get to the local network. Here, fix it. Some people want that, or some people don't, and some people want to not worry about it if a Ruby gem isn't working, or some people. I'm just curious to hear, you know, how deep you go before you say that's not my job. Maybe. I'll walk it to you.
Just to touch on what he was talking about, I work on a small team. It's me and one other developer, and we run load balance servers on Amazon just because of the type of traffic we get. So for us, we do everything. We know we have to learn how to install Linux, run all the dependencies, libraries, everything. So for us, we are DevOps and the programmers, and we run everything. It depends on what you're working on, and it depends on how many people you have there to help you. When it's 2 people, we have to know it all. For a team of 10, you may be able to say, okay, you can focus on this, and you know, you focus on the programming, you focus on this. But so it all depends on your team, what you're working on, and like I said, the resources that are required for your service.
Yeah, with one of my clients that I'm currently working with, it's very similar to that. We're a pretty small team. I don't know, 10 or so developers, and you know, the saying that we always go with is that ticket is not done until it's in production, operating correctly, and hasn't caused new resource problems. And we do have one guy that is kind of our infrastructure guy, but his main job is to help members of the team provision new infrastructure correctly and with the correct security concerns and all of that kind of stuff. But we don't really ever just throw anything over the wall to him and say, hey, Chris, go have fun, you know, and let us know when it's done. It's always kind of a collaborative thing, and you know, it really is, the developers are responsible for operations.
So I've always looked at this as kind of something that happens as a part of natural progression with technology, where maybe the technology that you're using is brand new. Maybe your development shop is just now getting into Ruby, and you might have one developer that is assigned to really research that. Well, it's going to become prerequisite on that developer to kind of really do the DevOps side of things. But then they make something wonderful, and you might start hiring to support that product now that they've created. So I really look at it as stages, that when it's in R&D, it kind of makes sense for the developer to be, you know, really involved on the DevOps side. But as the product and the technology matures within that environment, it becomes a situation where after you have, 5, 10, 15 people maybe developing on a product, it really kind of becomes a natural progression that you kind of need maybe an individual or a group of individuals to just be responsible for the DevOps side of it. But that's just the way I see it.
I think that the relationship between like developers and ops in a large organization would really, in a lot of ways, mirror, say, the relationship between developers and like a DBA, right? Like a DBA is responsible for indexes and helping you tune a query, and they understand, the database probably at a level that most developers don't. So you're going to collaborate with them when you have this slow query or this table structure you need to get right. And it's the same kind of thing with ops. The server is just like a database, and you need to just collaborate with someone on your team who understands how to get the security right or how to get the provisioning right, and understand that together and make a plan so that in the future, the other developers are able to take advantage of, the work that you did to get that right.
That's what I get to on the whole common bit. We've got like 80 developers where I'm at, and that's strictly software development. That's not counting infrastructure, servers, networking, project management, blah, 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 whatever. And the more often, and they're pretty much well siloed off. We're much better at working together a lot more now often, but in the past it was quite painful to sit down with one another of other parts like a DBA and a developer to try and figure out, hey, what's going on with this query? How do we get this sped up? As far as how much does a developer need to know? Yeah, I stop at the wire. Actually, I stop at like level 4 or 3. You can see that I don't know that much on it. Actually, I stop with Fiddler. How about that? I'll go on to Fiddler, and anything below that is like I don't even really want to know. But I think it helps to have at least a general idea of each segment of networking, infrastructure, how your computer works. Personally, I find it very frustrating when someone doesn't have an understanding of how their computer works. Like even just that, like there's a CPU, there's RAM, there's a motherboard, there's plugs that hook all your drives together. It bugs me if they don't, but there's not necessarily a need for that. But if you can't diagnose a problem on your own computer, it lends me to be concerned about how well you're going to diagnose a problem with an application running on a computer that you don't even have access to or don't even know where it's at or anything like that. So that's I guess really mainly is a diagnostic capability, an ability to like see a problem and try to figure out, even if you don't know that area, how to get enough information to at least point you in the right direction for someone to talk to or some place to look for.
So you touched on something really interesting there that I liked about knowing or paying attention to like how your own personal environment works and about how that relates to like other environments that you may be working in. And I think that kind of ties like, it seems like a lot of us agree that we should have some sort of like cursory understanding of like the environments that we're working in, where our applications are going to be deployed and functioning and stuff. I guess my next question would be like, how do we nurture those skills, like that type of understanding? I mean, for me, I run Linux full time because I hate happiness and I don't like my slides to work properly whenever I need them to. But I'm sure there's like better ways or more. I'm really curious, like what some of the ways that like as developers we're all sort of like picking up those skills and learning them.
So yeah, I learned probably most of my most relevant stuff by working with people that were farther down the path than I was and that were generous enough to take time to explain it to me and help me see how things work and also give me room to make mistakes so that I deployed bad code to prod, and then they came along and said, here's why this was a bad idea and here's what we can do to fix it. And so it's a, you know, combination of mentorship, trial by fire, and then just figuring out stuff that I needed to figure out to be able to get a job done. Also lots of Google.
As somebody that's probably equally as old and been doing this so long, you know, back in those days, it was system administration was where I started at. But it's kind of one of those things that, you know, that was pre-Google, you know, for me. I see some other guys, yeah, you didn't, so, and in a lot of cases, you know, there wasn't just a wealth of knowledge for you to be able to rely on. It was, here's the problem, here's what, you know, it needs to run all the time. And if it's down, it's your problem. And you don't want it down. And, you know, it's kind of interesting that as you look, and, you know, I think about this question of how do we kind of translate that knowledge in, it's also interesting to me that over this history that I've had of 30-ish years, that it's gotten way more complicated. It is way more complicated to deploy an application and monitor it and keep it up today than it ever has, I think, ever. I mean, the number of layers, the number of things that we have to know, you know, the Docker container, you know, I fought a kernel bug a few weeks ago, you know, a specific Debian kernel wasn't working with Docker right, and I mean, the levels of things, because we have so many layers of abstraction, I think part of it is becoming to know it. So I mean, running Linux on a machine, at least even part-time, it's like, oh, okay, that's my deployment environment, this is what I'm deploying to, I'm going to run this at least, you know, X hours of my week. So, and it was amazing the things that I had to work out for me to use it, and it's like, oh, that's why I have problems in my application. Because, you know, you get that disconnect. Oh, it works on my Mac. You know, and it's like the old days where it's like, oh yeah, that .NET application, you know, that .NET 2.0 application that you have to log into that one special machine and you can compile it and copy it out to the server. And that one special machine's now a VM. I shouldn't admit to this stuff, right? But I think a lot of it has to do with actually kind of digging into those things that we're deploying to. I mean, the best way that you get to know your database is to actually get into some of those database details. It's realizing I don't have any knowledge here and I need some more.
Just gonna say, I definitely see what you're saying about it getting more complicated, but I think also in some respects, it's gotten easier. Like, some of the first applications I deployed, you know, like you said, we had to spec machines, we had to get them into the server closet, make sure that they were actually on the network, then get all the dependencies installed. And now today, most of the applications that I manage, it's git push Heroku, and I'm done. And I mean, they've abstracted a lot of that complexity away. The complexity's still there, but I don't have to face it every day. And I like that.
I even know the fact that I can't use Heroku on a lot of things.
Yeah, I would second what Jeremy just said. I haven't had to read the manual for a hardware SCSI card to figure out which jumper to change to get into RAID 10 mode for a long time. So some things have gotten simpler for sure. And the manual's a PDF I have to download from the internet, right? But I guess this is not preaching. This is just, I'm going to do the personal anecdote thing, because I don't think everybody can do my way of doing what Paul's suggesting and answering your question, which is you have to have continual variety in your technology, which means you have to have multiple projects going all at the same time that you're working on, and a lot of them have to be yours to screw up, and you have to choose or I'm saying you, I choose every project, one or two things that I wanted to learn, and not too many or I'll never do the project. One or two things that I'm going to do different on this one instead of the way I already know how to do it. So I'm doing a project for Starspace right now because I'm here, and I got to move our invoices from this online service to that online service, and I do Mule all the time for work, so I chose Apache Camel, and I'm going to run it in Spring Boot, and I'm going to put it on Azure instead of AWS, and that's enough different things. Let's get this project done. So the way I do it is I have enough little projects I'm always doing that I can change a couple of things, and now I've tried 2 instead of 1, and I know the differences, and when I had to get that working because I own the problem, because it's nobody else's problem, because it's my project, I will figure out how to make it work, like Paul was saying. I mean, really, and in an enterprise, this applies too. There's this time I've noticed people come to where they have a problem, and someone's helping them with it, and they kind of let them finish it. And that's when you stop learning. If you go finish it with that person, you will learn whatever they're doing to finish it. Or if you just own it all the way to the end, even when someone's helping you, it's going to be a whole different experience than if at some point you finally say, you know what, I got work to do, right? At least somehow I would stay tuned in with what that person or that, what happens with whatever that was that you decided to give to another person.
So I like what Ryan was saying about learning by collaborative effort, and kind of Jeremy and Jeff hit on this too. The more I think, I want to take a step back to kind of think about the definition of DevOps again, because the more I think about it, the more I just don't really know what it is. What is a DevOps? And I'm kind of, I've thought about this over, since I've heard the phrase, pop up 3 years ago or something. Like if I'm automating something on my own computer, is that DevOps? And then I'm thinking, no, that just kind of seems like operations. I'm not coding while I'm automating something. Maybe I am. So then that's kind of the development phase and the operations phase. If I'm, provisioning a server, I'm creating, updating my Docker file or something. That's more operations-y. It's not so much development. So I really feel like when I think about DevOps, the right way to think about it, at least in my opinion, is I think it has to involve collaboration. I don't think you can do it alone. And this is just my own definition. But I like Jeff was mentioning, getting with the DBA, or getting with the guy who does is kind of an operations guy. Like if I want to get something into production, I'm at a big company, I'm a developer, I'm going to sit with an operations guy and we're going to hammer this out. And to me, I'm thinking that's what DevOps is and makes sense to me. Like it's this act, it's this action. It's not like a position. It's not a thing that I can do on my own. It's a communication engagement, I guess, if you will. And I don't know. I feel like I had this breakthrough a minute ago thinking about that, and that's just my own personal thought. I'm probably, everyone's got their own definition of DevOps. But that's, I don't know. I'm gonna make the statement that I don't think you can do it alone and call it DevOps. Who wants to challenge me?
What if you're a team of 1? Yeah, I'm a team of 1.
Then I think you do development sometimes, and then you do operations sometimes. I don't think you do DevOps, unless you. Yeah.
So in my definition to counter that is for you're developing your application, you have to know, okay, we're going to store images on S3. We've got to have code that loads it on S3, that downloads it to the cache and serves it up for everybody else. So if you don't know the operations side of that, you're not going to know how to code it in the first place. So that's where DevOps comes into play. You have the specific things that you want to accomplish. Some of that's going to require coding and programming and using the libraries that you have to make use of those servers, those resources. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck with, okay, here's all my code can do. If I'm not using S3, or I can't use S3 until I learn how the S3 structure works. And the same thing goes through for load balancing. You have to know how your load balancers work, how they function. And if you're trying to code for that, you have to know it, at least somewhat, or have someone to tell you this is how you have to do that. So that's where the DevOps comes into play. You have to know how those things work to know how to code for them. Otherwise, you're just spinning your wheels, or you have to do it your own way, which may or may not work.
So I would say counter or expand on your definition of DevOps to say that I think it's more about defining process, the process of how your code goes from code to actually running in production and being monitored and alerting that happens with it. And you might be doing that all by yourself, and you might start doing it all by yourself, and then eventually as your team or your product grows, then another person might come in or a whole nother team might come in. But if you are able to come up with a really well-defined process for how that happens end to end and document it well, then you have room to be able to bring in other people and collaborate on it. And maybe you can bring in somebody who has more specialty in a certain area like server security, and they can help you beef that up. But the process is already defined, and they can just start taking ownership of certain pieces of it. but also anybody can come in and do that because you've got a well-defined process for it.
So I had, several months ago, I went to the DevOps Enterprise Summit in San Francisco with the head of the change enablement, production control. Sorry. It's production control, but they've changed their name to change enablement. They're trying to change the way they do things. But one of the things that the head of that department was, of that division was saying is they kind of see another aspect of DevOps, and not only just the process change, but the idea of bringing development practices into the operations side. Things such as version control, reviews, automated pushing, automated deployment stuff, instead of just operating like someone pushing a button or just doing the things and everything being a snowflake. And I thought that was kind of an interesting, different definition that goes alongside the process part. You almost can't have one without the other. And if your development process isn't smoothed out and well in a version control, a continuous manner, then any kind of DevOps you try to do is going to just kind of be for nothing. It's the whole, fixing the point of constraint. Anything else doesn't do anything. It doesn't help the throughput of anything.
So through the power of Googling, I looked up to see what Martin Feller had to say. And he's kind of reiterating exactly what you said, is that it's just a buzzword unless you actually put the culture together, right culture together. Increased collaboration, shared responsibility, no silos, autonomous teams, quality in the development process, and feedback and automation. Basically, you got to have all those things coming together. That it's really kind of this, to me, it's almost, we're taking the best of both worlds, and instead of having them being two separate teams, they really become part of one.
So I actually see it as both a position and an activity in that it is a role. And sometimes you're acting in a role. So just like we give roles to applications, and when the application is doing some function within that role, it's acting in that role. Same thing with people, that roles are assigned to people. We might have multiple roles, we might have a single role, and it's all based upon capacity. If I have the completion capability to do the DevOps stuff, the DevOps role, then why not do it? If I enjoy doing it, why not doing it? Why not do it? But again, in a large organization where you have 30, 40, 50 developers, it may make sense to assign a role to a specific person, but that doesn't mean that it's, okay, now you do it. I don't do DevOps, you do DevOps, because that's your primary role. I think you run the risk of becoming too divorced, and there becomes a knowledge gap where when you're talking to them about what you want to push live, you're not talking the same language. So I've always looked at that as, this is a good reason and good argument for doing side projects just on your own, because when you're doing side projects on your own, if you're in a big organization where one or two or a team of people kind of own that role, then it's something where you're not becoming completely divorced from the automation and really setup and server side of the technology. You're seeing both the programming and the setup and automation side of it.
As a recruiter, we're seeing more of the DevOps positions come in Oklahoma. Oklahoma's a little bit slower than the rest of the nation, as I'm sure you're well aware of. But I think it goes back more to what you said was what they want when they're looking for that, someone to set up best practices. This is how we do it. This is how it's defined. That's what we want. And then to use the tools to make it easier for developers to automate things. A big thing no one's mentioned is monitoring systems, Salt Stack and things like that. They want those skill sets, so someone come and monitor it, own it, take care of it. I don't know how that works how the dynamics between developers and a DevOps when we're placing these roles. But I think it's more of what you said. They just want someone to come in. This is how we're going to do it. This is the tools we're going to use. This is kind of going to put best practices down. And then we're going to have someone who can monitor to make sure they own that system. And so, yeah, it's becoming more popular in Oklahoma City, but yeah, still people don't know what it, I mean, even the managers we talk to, they don't know what they want. But I think it's a combination of what everyone said.
Yeah, so some things the last few people have said made me realize that I think there's kind of some unspoken assumptions that we've all made about what DevOps is that might be worth laying out. One is that like if you're developing an iPhone app that doesn't have a server component, you're not really ever going to do DevOps, right? You're developing a thing that is on a device, it ships out, gets deployed, people use it. Or if you're developing like a standard desktop app, there's really not a lot of DevOps that goes into that. So I think one assumption is that you're doing something that's resembling a web app. And then two, you're doing something that somewhat resembles continuous delivery. Whether it's like full real continuous delivery or not, maybe not. But if you're one of these large companies that will work on a web app for 6 months between deployments, there's probably not a whole lot of real true DevOps happening in that company because you're developing in isolation for a long time and then one big, okay, let's deploy this thing and get it out there working. And I think that kind of having a cycle of, a somewhat continuous cycle of development, deployment, feeding back into each other is kind of a requirement to be doing real DevOps.
You got my blood pressure up, Jeremy. I don't share your assumptions, or the assumptions you stated anyway. I think mobile apps, desktop apps are ripe for it. They're where we need it the most. The place in town I'm working on a proposal for now deploys every 6 months to POS systems and stores all over the place. And one thing I feel is key to where DevOps lives. I don't know if it's DevOps or it's the context of DevOps is small batch sizes and frequent changes. I think it comes from lean and that philosophy of delivery. There's a book I recommend a lot called Designing Delivery by Jeff Sussna. DevOps is in there along with several other things because it includes this cybernetic feedback loop. That's the actual academic word for it, I'm sorry, but just like this feedback based on reality of product development, QA, operations, and support for how we make services for people. That's all we're doing. Software is for people on a phone, on a point of sale, wherever it's at. And so I think DevOps is useful as a word because it's not all of that. It's just this part between making changes to how software works and running that software together. And I think what makes, to me, DevOps worth having a word for is because it is the fact that you are making the ownership of how it runs and making change to it one thing. So it changes it from something that I write code and I run code and they're different, where I get these roles, dev, ops, and then somebody wants to make a DevOps team, and now you got 3 instead of 2. You change that into what we are making is a living, breathing, changing thing. It's running in production, and I'm changing it in dev, and all of that pipeline is one, and we are working on it. I think that's where DevOps, the term, has value to me. If you start to think of that as the vision for what we're trying to make our teams work like and our software work like and the pipeline of delivery, and where should QA look? All of it. Production, dev, QA, right? How different should dev be from production? Well, look, it's one thing. So let's try to make it kind of similar, right? I think that's where I like the word anyway. I think everybody's right that it's been commandeered by the marketing people, and all technical words have that happen. But we called it dev and ops because we were jamming the 2 things together because I don't think it was healthy for us to separate them long ago, which we did. when we were young. and people who were sysadmins started developing and wanted to get a higher salary by calling themselves software developers. And so we stopped being system administrators anymore, but we really still are. So I think that's why it's a worthwhile word.
I've been listening to everybody kind of give their own definitions of DevOps, and it sounds like if you kind of take a step back and look at it from a really high level, everybody's defining kind of the same philosophy of workflow, right? DevOps is almost like a philosophy of workflow. How do you make everything as efficient as possible? What can you automate? What can you do to decrease the amount of repetitive work that you're doing? Like all of these different pieces get into it, quality, continuous deployment, all of the different parts that go into it. But you're all talking about the same thing. It's just kind of philosophy of workflow is the term that I've got in my mind. Does that sound about right? Yeah. Also, everybody that's talked pretty much has been a developer. There's a systems guy in here. I wondered if he had a different perspective on this.
Okay, I'm a systems guy who took Fortran 77 in college, and C, and avoided COBOL. What I hear in this room, and what I hear talking to my brother, who's a data center director, is the same thing that we saw between desktop services and systems. If I'm a systems guy, you're a keyboard slinger. What the hell do you know? Sitting in with a bunch of developers, you know, they're over there talking about ETL and this and that and something else, and then the conversation comes over to my end and they're like, oh, you don't know that. And I'm like, I've been doing databases since when? And it's communication. I heard this word over here. It's about talking to each other, figuring out what each other knows, and if we call it a title, we call it a title. At the end of the day, from my perspective, what can I do to help you dig that hole? And if I need to help you with your Linux instances on EC2 or your IAM or anything like that, cool. You should be able to administer your own laptop. I'm sorry. I'm going to draw the line on that one. But that's just work together, break down the walls, do whatever has to be done to get the job done. And at the end of the day, the labels, what do they mean? That's just kind of my view of get it done, who cares what it's called. It goes against my rules these days, but sure. I'm not going to whack that one too hard because growth requires chaos. I came from, my last organization was so mired in 1890. Joe's going to laugh, he knows where I came from. Was so mired in 1890 that growth has ceased. Productivity has ceased. Outcomes are no longer being met. It was the public sector, so you don't have to actually do anything, right? Chaos is growth. Failure is growth. If crap blows up, figure out how to fix it. Learn something and go on.
I'll take the softball a second. So back in the late 80s, I'm managing a VAX at a university, which is a big mid-range, multi-million-dollar piece of hardware. And it was one of several mainframes we had. and 300 plus users on it, and most of them were students. I was on the academic side, because the mainframe for the administrative side was the people on the other side of the cubicles. So all of a sudden, one day, everything stops working. I mean, including my monitoring system just stops. And this is cooperative multitasking back then. This is before we had pure preemptive. And literally, I'm at a higher enough level of things that my terminal shouldn't ever stop. It stops. So it takes me a few days to finally figure out what had happened. No, and it happened every now and then. And it would last a few seconds. And it's one of these things, it would last like 3 or 4 seconds. And I finally tracked it down. And it was a psychology student that was running a survey where people would walk up to a terminal and start picking answers from, A, B, C, or D. And he wanted a pause between them, so he wrote a for loop, a tight for loop with, execute this thing 40,000 times, and that would give him his 4-second pause. Now, as system administrator, I'm like, what the fuck? Now this, psychology student is like, it works great. Except for the person next to him, it suddenly stops his. Why does that happen? Now, in this process, I said, you need to do a sleep. What's a sleep? I start digging through, we have a wall of manuals. I start digging through they're using BASIC, so I dig through the BASIC manual. There is no sleep in BASIC. So I have to write a sleep for him and give it to him. And that kind of solves the problem, except for the psychology department's all pissed off at us again, because they're constantly pissed off at you. So anyway, this problem hasn't changed in 30 years. Developers still do. I saw a thing the other day from somebody who won't name, who had a set of developers, multiple developers, running Ruby that didn't have a point object, as in location point object in the code they were working with. So they actually created a point in Postgres using PostGIS and did this manipulation on it and back and forth with the database. And it literally was like, because they thought, oh, well, Postgres has a point object, we'll just use theirs. Without any real thought of, okay, there's 5,000 applications. Literally, it's a large Postgres application, and it was bringing it to its knees. It's the same problem that kind of happens over again. So there's almost always this concept with ops. That's kind of what helps build that wall. It's like you as a developer, yeah, you may have solved your problem, but you just created another one for someone else. And I think that's part of what causes that friction, is that just because you solved one problem doesn't mean you didn't create 10 others. And I think part of what helps narrow the DevOps world is that both we're automating ops, we're taking coding practices and putting it into operations, but we're also breaking down that wall and bringing operations knowledge back into, it's like when I told you your application knows best what it needs, we're bringing that other side in too. So it's a little bit of both.
Okay, I'm going to ask permission for this one. But I have a story where I'm the one lobbing the softball. I'm the sociology student. I'm not the sociology student, but I have a story about that. And if y'all don't want to go down and start showing, oh, here's my scar and that scar, you can just tell me to shut up. That's fine. I actually have this on my website as a failure. I think. I don't know. If I don't, I'm going to have to put it on there. So this was college. This was Vatterott College back in 2002. And I was just twiddling my thumbs, and I was ahead of the class, blah, 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 whatever. There's half of us were ahead of the class, so technically I was not, actually. Anyways, so I wanted to make a chat application using Visual Basic. And it was working pretty good, Now, I don't have a good knowledge of networking at the time, so I'm broadcasting the message on UDP on 30 different ports and letting the receiver just figure out which one applies to it. I was like, okay, cool. Well, I wanted to do a progress bar. Well, everything was too small. So I decided to grab the Doom exe, which is 10 megabytes, because I wanted to see the progress bar actually move across. And so I fired that across. So you know where this is going. And so I was firing that 10 megabytes across all 30 ports. That turns out to be about 300 megabits on a 10100 or a 10 megabit network right at our college. It's very small. And so whenever I sent that, everyone was like, I can't get my documents. I can't get my documents. My professor came up to me like half a dozen times telling me that this was the problem, but he wasn't telling me why. And then it just dawned on me like, oh no, that's me. And so that's why I try to be, that's part of what you're saying, what you were saying just a minute ago is you have to be cognizant of and try to think, okay, how is this actually going to affect? This is something that I'm doing that's not what I usually do. Let me pause and reflect on what this is going to have an effect on. If I'm not 100% sure, get a hold of someone, just bring it in for a few seconds. Maybe they can give you like, hey, you don't want to do that for this reason. But it's that pausing mentality. To move faster, you actually sometimes have to slow down a bit. That whole square wheel, wheelbarrow, trying to put new wheels on it, you got to stop to put the new wheels on it so you can go faster.
But is that a DevOps issue? I mean, sending all that data across, or is that a network admin issue?
That was an app screw up.
Well,
that was my fault.
Aside from that, I mean, who would be the person who's supposed to catch that?
I would say that would be a monitoring issue, that someone wasn't monitoring enough. Okay, let me say that again. So that would be a monitoring issue, that someone on the network side wasn't monitoring enough to get a hold of, hey, this machine is flooding the network. Now, oddly enough, a few years prior at Western Heights High School where I was at, they had a monitoring system. A few of us found the chat app in Windows and started chatting between each other. And about 5 minutes later, we get the network admin walking into the room and talking to our professor and our teacher. And our teacher says, I know who you are. I'm not going to say it, but you need to stop what you're doing right now. And we knew what was going on. So that was monitoring in effect. And I don't know, DevOps is more of a development operation. It's the flow, like it's the workflow he's talking about.
Yeah, so we're out of time, so I think we're gonna have to wrap it up. Paul, you have any closing thoughts that you want to share? Okay. No, real quick though, Lucas is gonna share a few words with us about Starspace, this event that we are in.
Thank you, Jeremy. So I'm Lucas Watson. I'm one of the co-founders here at Starspace 46. And along here with Ryan Hogue, sorry, and Hague, I've got a friend named Hogue who spells it real close. It's so confusing. Anyway, Starspace 46 is a co-working center. It's this Techlahoma event space, the Techlahoma Cox communication event space, and we are separate from Techlahoma, but very closely intertwined as far as mission goes, right? So if you are a Techlahoma member, thank you for donating to Techlahoma. Everybody really appreciates that. That money goes to buy the pizza and take care of everything. But that doesn't go directly to Starspace, right? So Starspace is a separate entity who also needs your support. So if you're not a member, please consider joining. A community membership is at $35 a month. If you work for a company that needs meeting space from time to time, whether it's an event space or one of the conference rooms, we have a lot of really good offerings there that we can put together for you and your company. We can build something custom that works for you. If you've got a team and you want them to be able to come work at a Starspace, let us know. We've got a ways to have a bucket full of day passes, so you can send 3 or 4 or 5 people here for a day, and then a different 5 next week, and maybe you have 20 or 30 or 50 day passes a day, so you can send your whole team down here to work and work in a conference room, work in the general area, even in the event space. If you need that much space, we can work all those things out. So anything that you guys might want to do at a place like Starspace, even if it's another event you've got an idea for putting on, give us a shout. Talk to Ryan, talk to me, talk to Ava, talk to Tommy, and anybody else that's involved with Starspace. Don't talk to Jonathan. He's got a day job, right? It's not his job. So leave Jonathan alone. But come talk to us. We've got a lot of great ideas. But again, if you're not a member of Starspace 46 and you would like to be, community memberships start at $35 a month, and we would love to see some more of you as new members on the rolls who come and work here and be part of our community. So that's all I got. Thanks.
I just want to slight detail on the pricing. 2017 retail is 40, so when you go to the website, you'll see that. So